As a certified enjoyer of Shadow of the Erdtree's remembrance bosses, I recently made a video after finding myself disconsolate over the parade of criticism I found on Reddit. Now, everyone's entitled to their opinions, and no one is wrong for disliking a boss. I do, however, think there are ways to approach FromSoft games that make the experience both easier and more rewarding. As I noted in my first video, much of the criticism seems motivated by the difficulty of a damage trading strategy. It would seem that many players enter boss fights with the intention of dealing as much damage as quickly as possible, while simultaneously absorbing a ton of damage themselves, but fractionally less than they can deal out, leading ultimately to a close victory. DLC bosses, however, don't always make this easy. Getting spanked a million times only to finally crush R'Lana with a great hammer or blasphemous blade would probably leave me feeling frustrated and unsatisfied as well. So in my initial video, I encouraged an approach that incorporates some of the tools of no-hit runners like myself. The idea was to make damage mitigation and pattern recognition a core part of your fight strategy, not to become a no-hit runner yourself unless you want to. Please check that video out for topics ranging from identifying combos and counterintuitive attacks and more. This video is going to serve as part 2, and here, as there, I am not aiming to explain every move of every boss, but rather to explain how you can learn them yourself. In my last video, I discussed attacks that have counterintuitive or mentally disarming timings, often in the form of delays. I gave one of Messmer's spear attacks as an example, but this attack from the Golden Hippo was also particularly painful to learn. One can find myriad examples of this across the game, but the solution is fairly straightforward. You just force yourself to learn the delay timing and then hit dodge at the right time. But sometimes merely delaying your roll or jump won't be sufficient. Sometimes there's some aspect of the timing or the spacing that makes evasive response far more complicated than simply going faster or slower. Let's dive into that now. I want to use this multi-hit combo from Romina because I think it's actually very edifying for almost every aspect of strategization. Now, when you first encounter it, you're almost certainly going to be screwed because it has a high degree of tracking, and the halberd sweeps actually stun lock you, so this attack can very easily be an instant death. With super complicated moves like this, step 1 is just to figure out what the hell is going on. So identify at least one component of it, look for that next time, and try to add in another component the next time you encounter it. Repeat this again and again to start building out the picture. In hindsight, we know that the move entails the following pattern. First, the snake coils into a tight S, the head then juts forward, dealing damage. It's followed by 2 rapid halberd swipes, then the snake comes back, which also deals damage, and then finally there's another halberd swipe. So this is a real doozy of a combo. There are, by my count, 5 points of damage, and it is very counterintuitive to dodge. When I encounter moves like this, my first step is to roll out as much as possible. This may not be the final strategy, but rolling out is often the most likely way to stay alive long enough to actually see the combo at all. Then I start experimenting with different roll directions. You'll learn quickly that rolling in is actually quite fatal. You may be able to evade the snake attack by rolling in, but then you're right in the hitbox of the double halberd attack. You won't have enough time to roll out, and the first of the attacks will stun lock you, which will make you just completely screwed. You're over. It thus becomes apparent that you must roll out of the snake attack, right? It's just logical deduction. Further experimentation will confirm that you roll out of the snake attack and also the halberd attacks, because if you roll back into them, the second one is going to stun lock you as well, and you're back to where you started. So you need to roll out for all 3. Then you roll in for the 4th snake attack. By doing so, you'll note, the 5th halberd attack will actually miss you completely. So with deliberate experimentation and meticulous attention, you'll divine the right solution to a move that otherwise subverts most damage tanking strategies. Commander Gaius is another quite infamous example. His charge attack can be quite frustrating, but again, with a more methodical approach, the difficulty is trivialized. I got chomped up the first few times I fought him, but I knew I needed to look for some sort of concrete marker around which to mentally pin different dodge timings. The easiest option was the end of his tusk. I then said, okay, let's see what happens when I dodge X far from his tusk, or Y far from his tusk. This gives me one singular fixed point so that when I do get it right, I don't have to guess how it was that I got it right. I know because I picked that initial marker. Ultimately, I wound up dodging right before my body made contact with the edge of his tusk, and after that, I never got caught by the charge attack again. Sometimes, a complicated response needs to include non-rolling moves. Midra's Phase 2 opening Frenzied Flame Blast can be evaded if you begin running immediately and sprint behind him. The fireball he uses to open the sort of unofficial Phase 2.5 is a bit unusual as well, in that it has partial but not full tracking. If you begin running or rolling right away, he'll track you and come down right on top of you. However, with some experimentation, you might notice that this tracking is actually on a sort of timer. It doesn't track forever, it tracks for a few seconds. And so if you can outlast the tracker by just sort of hanging out under him for a few seconds and then running away, and you'll be totally fine. Likewise, Meteor's spinning smash attack proved extremely tricky for me, and I just couldn't nail down an accurate roll given the temporal duration of the active hitbox when she lands. So like I mentioned in my first video, consistent failure should be a prompt to think about alternative strategies. In this case, I started running as soon as she launched into the air, and then dodge rolled when she landed, which proved much safer than dodge rolling from a stationary position. Sometimes, attacks can be dodged, rolled, jumped, or strafed with equal efficacy, and Midra is a study in this bounty of choice. But other times, you are highly disadvantaged by rolling. Meteor's 3-burst laser blast is actually quite difficult to dodge all three of consistently, but running past it works with much greater efficacy. Furthermore, her ground explosion extends so far in all directions that rolling is actually somewhat unsafe, and I found the best move is to actually just stand still in the gaps, which you can see based on them not being red, which will allow the explosion to go off around you, rather than you having to worry about rolling through the explosion and potentially, ending up inside it when your iframes expire. Hey, just a quick note before we go on. If you like this video, please consider subscribing. I make 3 kinds of Soulsborne content: video analyses on topics like boss design, combat evolution, and more. Second, guides like this video. And third, challenge runs like all of the no-hit footage that you see in this video. I'd be very glad to have you in our community. Let's talk a little bit about positional variation. Now, sometimes you'll have nailed everything about a combo and have some good results, only for you to, on, say, a 5th time, do the exact same thing and somehow get hit. It can be utterly befuddling and exasperating to see such painstaking progress undone so suddenly and seemingly so capriciously. When this happens, there's a good chance that you're encountering the hazards of positional variation. Bosses in the DLC seem to be especially sensitive to your position relative to their bodies, and this tends to be truer the bigger the enemy or the more area their combo covers. Because bigger enemies and bigger combos have bigger hitboxes, the importance of where you are relative to them becomes concomitantly more pronounced. Take, for example, Mesmer's Assault. The first moves are pretty easy to dodge, and chances are that it's the aerial spear attack that's going to fuck you, and it can seem like no single response works consistently. Again, our strategy is to pay attention and look for hidden variables. The first variation you'll find is how far back he flies after his initial swirling fire spear moves. This can vary, and just to fast forward to after the realization so I can describe it now, it's contingent on how much you move towards him during his upward fire swirls, and on whether or not he runs into the arena's walls during his retreat. If you stay relatively still, and if he doesn't run into a wall, he'll zip all the way back, giving you time to run away and roll at the last second. If, however, he only does a short-ranged retreat for whatever reason, maybe you move too much towards him, maybe he hits a wall, whatever, but if you notice that he hasn't flown all the way back, he's kind of got stuck at mid-range, then you will need to change your strategy, because he'll start spearing you in that case before you even have time to run away. So when this happens, you need to dodge inward. So with some experimentation and deliberate observation, even though this one's tricky, once you notice that the one thing that seems to change is how far his retreat is, you can then determine that, okay, the reason that the results are different is because of this variable, and let me see how I respond to it. And that's a sort of general strategy that you can apply to moves that are complicated in general. Be cognizant that the camera can also play a role in positional variation. Camera lock-ons can have the effect of sort of pulling you in the direction of the boss, and you can factor this into your strategy. This was particularly salient in the fight against the Divine Dancing Lion during his Vortex move. It was very easy to jump the first spray, but with each progressive spiral, I found myself sort of getting sucked closer to his body by the camera angle, making jumping less viable. You can either manually pull yourself back to keep jumping, or once you get closer, you can just switch to rolling for those final sprays. But pay attention to the camera and its role in positional variation, because even though it's the camera's fault, it's still going to be on you to change your strategy. Now, obviously, you can't beat a boss by evasion alone. You have to at some point attack them yourself as well. In your initial phases of a damage mitigation strategy, you'll naturally be paying more attention to attack patterns and how to evade them, but you should also be attacking as well, building up that mental vista of when you succeed and when you get interrupted. The ends of combos are going to be the most natural times for counterattacking, but in your initial mindless hack and slash, you might by chance notice some instances in which a mid-combo counterattack actually succeeds. Be sure to note this down in your mind. The Putrescent Knight has a branching combo in which this variation here permits a safe mid-combo lateral punishment, as I show here. Its alternative variation, however, did not allow me to get the same attack off safely, so I built this counterattack into my branching pathways strategy when fighting him. You'll also want to pay attention to times when a boss can end a combo prematurely. If you correctly identify the premature conclusion, you can slip in an early counterattack, but misidentifying it can be hazardous. If you misidentify it as ending, but it's actually continuing, you'll face the consequence of getting hit when you attempt to attack. But conversely, if you misidentify it as continuing when it's actually ended, by the time you realize your mistake, you'll have squandered the window for punishment, thus prolonging the fight, which itself is not a great thing. Meteor has several attacks that illustrate this principle at work. These two jumping head slams can be followed by a third, but sometimes they end after two. This two-hand slam can either stop after the hands slam, or it can be followed by Meteor conjoining her hands into a fist and slamming them immediately down in rapid succession. In each case, you have a quick decision to make about whether a counterattack is viable. You have two options once you've identified a variable counterattack scenario. You can withhold from counterattacking in all cases if you lack confidence in your ability to discriminate between viable and unviable branches, or you can attempt to discern the signs, often telegraphed with extreme brevity. In Meteor's case, I found reading her body language quite doable, but in other cases, like Bale's head charge versus his static electricity charge, I had to adopt an approach that helped deal with both, since I could not reliably perceive the difference in time. I spoke about this latter example more fully in part 1 of the video, so you can check that out. Finally, not all counterattack windows are created equally. You'll want to note not only the existence of these windows, but also their respective generosities. When possible, extract the most out of a window with a heavy, jumping, or charged attack, or an Ash of War, as these will not only do damage, but do extra posture damage as well. Some Ashes of War, depending on what they are, may inflict status damage as well. After Romina's spiral attack, you'll be at a distance if you stand still, as you should, because you won't get hit, but She has a long recovery window, so this is a prime opportunity to use an Ash of War that extends far out or launches your body, like I do here with Mesmer's spear. Midra has several openings that are long enough to do a charged attack or a distance closing Ash of War, like the Poison Flower blooms twice, which I've affixed to this great katana. The Divine Dancing Beast and Rolana didn't have the longest counterattack windows, but through trial and error, I was able to find opportunities to use Impaling Thrust on the Milady sword, which is a DLC sword, and Ash of War that discharges with relative celerity, but that also deals an inordinate amount of posture damage. So this was a really good find for dealing some quick posture damage and dealing an enormous amount of damage against her. Finally, I want to talk about identifying hitboxes. I've spoken before about hitbox exploitations, and these come up so frequently with DLC bosses that I think it's worth diving into in even more detail than I already have. There are some attacks or components of attacks that will simply not hit you when you're standing still. It's difficult to actively seek these out, but a key strategy I utilize is that in the chaos of my initial encounters when I'm groping around blindly, should I by chance happen not to get hit by an attack, I try my hardest to remember it and add it to my mental list. I might not fully remember it or fully understand why I didn't get hit, but I'll remember enough about it for me to begin actively searching for it, and that's the key part here. On my first encounters with Mesmer, I was rolling as best I could to new moves and often doing a pretty bad job. But I noticed that with some of his flame spiral moves, the ones especially in the air, I wasn't getting hit sometimes. Eventually, knowing that this is where I should be looking, I was able to sort these flame spirals into two attacks. This one, and this one. After further observation and experimentation, I was able to identify the moments in each that won't hit you if you stand still. Taking a look at it here, and then here. Commander Gaius has a very beefy combo with his mount that involves back and forth, irregularly timed attacks from both Gaius and the Hippo. As I got spanked by them, I noticed purely by chance that rolling here, in this direction, allowed me to avoid both of these hits, and from then on, I was able to treat these two attacks as a singular attack dealt with by a singular response. Romina, like Mesmer, has a very flashy aerial body roll that looks like it will require immense amounts of precise dodging, but in actuality it only requires you to dodge it a single time at the beginning and then stand still, and absolutely nothing from the rest of it will hit you. Tyr's laser beam missile creates a triangle with her in the ground, and if you're within the triangle, no dodge is necessary. She, of course, also has a very large gap in the revolving laser beam attack where you can just sort of camp out between the two lasers and perhaps fire projectiles at her or, just stand there and do nothing. In some of these cases, especially Meteor's, the existence of these hitboxes is pretty obvious. But in these other cases, I don't think they're that apparent. I certainly didn't identify their existence extemporaneously on my first try. Instead, I stumbled into them by sheer ineptitude in what Bob Ross would call a happy accident. What I want to stress, though, is that you can take this happy accident and make it deliberate. Pay attention when these accidents happen and work to recreate them until they are the fruits of your labor, until they are something you do rather than something done to you. Wrapping up now, these are some of the things I've been thinking about as I've no-hitted more Remembrance bosses since my last guide video. I want to re-emphasize the point that I'm neither trying to teach you how to beat each individual boss, nor am I saying the only way to play Elden Ring is to do it hitless. Instead, I'm offering a range of strategies for how you can take what seems like chaos and, through effort, impose order upon it. Doing so will make fights winnable more quickly and reveal to you more of the mechanical ingenuity of these bosses, in turn making the experience overall that much more rewarding. Thanks so much for watching.